But I'm gonna rush this.
It looks like you had some prepared remarks there.
I'm not entirely sure. It is set up. It is. That will be enough audio into it. There's no way to line out from that into that. I think it's pointing the right way. I'm just going to check it.
Is it pointing the right
Yeah, I
way?
can check the shot.
Okay, yeah, that's very good.
It's pretty good. You got the whole,
Test. All good?
yeah, that's good.
Is it actively recording?
Yeah, I see
Is
your
the red thing moving forward?
50 seconds, yep.
Great.
Red dots on. I'll keep an eye on it.
Make sure it doesn't move. I think just use muting. Jackie can tell you where that is.
From what? Birth?
That's right. It's so nice that they're it's really fun.
Ron, that reading produced the best feeling.
I'm sorry?
Your reading. It's,
Well, what?
but I mean it.
This is Laura.
We spoke on the phone.
Then you did refuse.
That color is amazing.
Oh, it's cool. Very good.
I have a water bottle back. I don't have a bottle. No, that voice is long. Now it goes. There'll be a video. Yeah, there were some questions. So to head off any concerns that we'll make it the next actually really very quickly. And we'll play the Evan Charles Dance.
Hello.
Oh, there he is.
Oh my goodness, what a snazzy little jacket you have on here today. Look at you, you have on a snazzy jacket too. Look, I missed your book thing. I was at the poetry project. Had a good time? Good. It was on my birthday, so it was a competing thing, you know. I was like, how could Ron have a party?
I read him just because
You did that to ruin my birthday party.
Oh, there you go.
Yes. Yes.
It's great. I really like
Karen wants to know if you're wearing a Kenneth tie.
So good evening. I think we're going to start. So I'm Robert Polito of the New School Writing Program, and it's my immense pleasure to welcome you to Kenneth Koch at 100, a celebration of the work and life of this virtuoso writer across poems, plays, and fiction. And he also was a legendary teacher of literature and writing, as well as perhaps our most astute and far-reaching philosopher on classroom teaching. At the outset, I want to thank poet and editor Jordan Davis for convening tonight and curating the extraordinary writers and filmmakers and artists you'll be hearing, whose name graced the programs Jordan also created. And I wish to thank Karen Koch, Mark Statman, and of course, all those gifted readers. At the New School, I want to thank archivist Wendy Shear, and also Laura Cronk, Lori Lynn Turner, John Reed, Kate Tooley, Hijab Ahmed, and Tom Higgins for their assistance and support tonight. Kenneth Koch was a singular poetry formalist, yet a singular improviser too. A sui generis combo that involved and prompted his own non-stop self-reinventions as a poet, and along the way, a major reinvention of American poetry. At once New York and international, Kenneth Koch was no stranger to this auditorium or this building, teaching at the New School from 1958 into 1966 in a continuing education pre-MFA writing world, when his colleagues here would have included Frank O'Hara, Amiri Baraka, Marguerite Young, Richard Yates, Irma Brandeis, Carolyn Gordon, and Alfred Kazu. So I thought, as a small way into tonight's celebration, here are a few archival images of Kenneth Koch at the New School. Joe? So this is Koch's first seminar at the New School from the fall of 1958. Note the range of writers across the centuries. This is Koch's first workshop at the New School, also from the fall of 1958. As you see, William Carlos Williams bumps up against André Breton and Henri Michel. This is Koch's workshop in comic writing from the spring of 1959. Note here, too, the range of the ostensibly comic writers he was assigning in the workshop, from Carroll, Thurber, and Perlman to Joyce, Eliot, Jarry, and Kafka. This is a photograph taken by Peter Moore on May 26, 1962, in the courtyard just out there between 66 West 12th Street and 65 West 11th Street at the inaugural series of New School poetry readings. There's Kenneth Koch with Marianne Moore, Robert Lowell, Stanley Kunitz, and Alan Duggan, in front of a now a regrettably long-sold Noguchi sculpture. This is a poster for the summer 1962 New School Poetry Readings, created by Koch and Frank O'Hara and curated that season by Robert Lowell. Here's an announcement of W.H. Auden as reader at the opening presentation of the Koch Chair New School Poetry Forum in November 1962. This is an announcement for a reading by Koch and O'Hara on June 9th, 1963, as part of the New School's Summer Festival of the Arts. And finally, from the summer of 1968, soon after Kenneth Koch left the New School for Columbia, we can see that via Bill Bergson, Koch was already part of the curriculum, close by John Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, Elizabeth Bishop, and Bob Dylan. So, on with the Kenneth Koch at 100 celebration, and please join me now in welcoming Jordan Davis.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you to the New School for offering this space for tonight's event, Kenneth Koch at 100.
Louder, Jordan.
Thanks, Robert. I worked as Kenneth's editorial assistant from 1990 until his death in 2002. Kenneth had great feeling for the New School. I am sure he would be pleased to know about a party celebrating his 100th birthday a couple weeks ago, February 27th. On behalf of the Kenneth Koch Literary Estate, I want to thank you all for coming out on a rainy day and a drinking holiday in a drinking district. We appreciate it. There are many people who are not here who in an ideal world would be joining us. Some are out of the country, such as Kenneth's daughter, the painter Catherine Koch, his son-in-law, poet and professor emeritus here, Mark Statman. David Lehman, a longtime New School professor, also sings for Katz. Some people I can't imagine celebrating Kenneth without have left us in the last few years. Kenneth's great student, David Shapiro, for instance. And there are many, many others, friends, peers, students, assistants who could just as well be on the stage tonight. Speaking of them, and of Kenneth, in a slightly different context, I want to quote something that I've read and carried in my head about something else. Whoever learns from someone else a single chapter, a single law, a single verse, a single word, even a single letter, must treat him with honor. I'm guessing that everyone in this room at some point learned something from Kenneth Koch that they value about how to read poetry, modern poetry, how to write it, also probably something about art, maybe love, friendship, and how to keep going. More than that, I have a feeling that everyone in this room who knew Kenneth remembers the feeling of excitement that he created by being interested in his subject and taking seriously his listeners' capacity to be interested in it too. We'll hear tonight from people who knew Kenneth in the 50s, 60s, and 70s as part of the same circles that helped create the spirit of those times. Other speakers studied with him or studied his work and went on to create totally amazing work in many different media, informed by Kenneth's exacting and exalted sense of the possibilities of art. We'll hear about Kenneth among the artists, Kenneth as a teacher, Kenneth as a writer of fiction, Kenneth as a friend. We'll hear poems from his books Thank You, Pleasures of Peace, The Art of Love, The Burning Mystery of Anna in 1951, One Train, and at least one uncollected greatest hit. We'll hear only a little bit about Kenneth's plays tonight. Apropos of nothing, I'll mention his play Bertha, about the mad queen of Norway who surrenders her country to the barbarians in order to conquer it again. We're planning an event around the plays for some time during the centenary year. People have talked for a long time about a spirit of play in Kenneth's work, and in his poem The Artist, a satirical artist's diary, it's from 1962 or 3, that more or less invented conceptual art. The persona lets us know what he thought about the subject. I often think play was my best work. It is an open field with a few boards in it. Children are allowed to come and play in play by permission of the Cleveland Museum. I look up at the white clouds. I wonder what I shall do and smile. Perhaps somebody will grow up having been influenced by play, I think, but what good will that do? Meanwhile, I am interested in steel cigarettes. So many of the best qualities of Kenneth's work are there: light, air, first-hand knowledge of real characters, flat speech about wild ideas, free from condescension, in pursuit of delight. If play was something Kenneth treated in brackets almost ironically, games were something he enjoyed wholeheartedly. He was an avid tennis player and ping pong player. His papers at the New York Public Library's Bird collection include a board game that he made with his family. His collaborations with John Ashbery and others were structured like surrealist games. One such poem, every line contains the name of a flower, a tree, a fruit, a game, and a famous woman, as well as the word bathtub. In New Year's Day, the poem with John Ashbery, every line includes a place name and a beverage. Water flowed slowly over the bridge in Danbury on New Year's Eve, while a Chicago of chocolate milk formed in Zurich. The root beer went floating by. This is fun and liberating on its own. Kenneth had the insight that this kind of game would be easy to teach to children. In fact, it would be a good way to teach children how to write poems. The exercises in Wishes, Lies, and Dreams, for example, to put a wish in every line and include a color and a place, clearly come from games. Kenneth included games in his fiction. In the story Le Jeu de la Mort et du Hasard, a father improvises a way to kill time by proposing riddles for the family to solve. It is read but stippled. I'll tell you later. He included games in his plays. In The Strangers from the Sea, two Swedes fight off depression by playing Ox, a game that recalls the mythic founding of Sweden by ensorcelled oxen of Hungary, who climb down off their boat onto a Swedish dock and take over the country. He did try to warn Scandinavia. And in his 1994 sequence on aesthetics, he wrote, "Aesthetically, one must say that inside a meaningless whole, significant particulars exist. Kicking, passing the ball, and rushing may fill us with life in even a one-sided game that's ended by freezing rain." Games are fun. They simplify life to focus on some part of it. They invite competition within serious closed systems, usually a little absurd, but that's part of the fun. Games have forms. They can be won. They end, and life goes on. Social relations are restored between people who may have been fierce rivals moments before. And in the process, you've practiced something that may or may not turn out to be useful. It's not important. The important part is the social part. That said, there's an opportunity cost to playing games. The time you spend playing the game, you aren't spending doing anything else. And the output of the game itself, when it really is just a game, is temporary. Beside the point. In these ways, games are very different from art and poetry, which is often forgiving about other activities, and which are intended to leave an artifact behind to consider. In both games and art, the experience is temporary. The feeling, you hope, will be durable. The game of Kenneth Koch's poems, if there is one, and I realize I'm taking a risk saying there is to be free to say anything, while making an energetic effort to say something important about the main thing. This includes the advice from some general instructions: do not wear a shirt more than 2 times without sending it to the laundry, as well as the next to last poem in New Addresses, his autobiography in the form of telling things what he remembers of them and what he wants from them still. In 1999's To Breath, he comes full circle with his praise in the 1962 poem Fresh Air. Addressing his own breathing, he tells it, "What I want you to do for me is this. I want to understand certain things and tell them to others. To do it, I have to get them right, so they're hard to resist. Stay with me until I can do this. Afterwards, you can go where you want." The first speaker on our program tonight is Charles North.
Hi. We only have about 5 minutes apiece, so I thought I would read a couple of Kenneth's poems. Is this loud enough?
Yes.
Neither of which is in any of his books. Jordan referred to one smash hit that was not collected. I'm going to read 2. I think one of them was one of the ones I told you about. But I have to say one quick thing first. Like a number of other people, a number of other poets particularly, I met Kenneth in this building in the last poetry workshop he taught here. It It sounds dramatic, but the class changed my life. I'd been to a number of schools, including graduate school in English and briefly law school, and Kenneth was the best teacher I had ever encountered. His excitement about poetry and its vast range of possibilities, as opposed to the narrow, mostly decorous, mostly conventional stuff that was appearing in the magazines, as well as being taught in graduate school English courses, along with his generous encouragement, were like nothing I had experienced. The first poem, titled The Car, Kenneth loved collaborations. He did loads of them. He, as I'll explain, he edited an issue of the legendary magazine Locus Solus devoted to collaboration. I think it's part of his generosity, as was his encouragement. The first poem, titled The Car, is a collaboration with his friend, the painter Jane Freilacher, which appeared in the legendary magazine Locus Solus. The magazine, I copied the poem because the cover of the magazine, it's from 1961. It's almost illegible, the print in it. The magazine ran for 5 issues, the second of which, edited by Koch, was devoted to collaborations. So this is the poem with Jane Freilacher. The Car. Choke. I'm a bloke. My name is Choke. Wheel. I'm a wheel. Central feel of the automobile. Gear. I'm a gear. You all fear me. Tires. I am the tires. A raspberry is filled with sin. Window. I'm a window. I know everything. Windshield wiper. I'm a wiper of window that's shield wiper. Crank. I'm a crank. Crankcase. I'm a crankcase. Nurse. Bottoms up. Transmission. I am the transmission, ever close to you. Trunk. I'm a trunk, full of personality. Dashboard. I am my setting sun, the dashboard. Clutch. I clutch. We like each other. Brake. Brake, brake, brake. Shift. Shifty me, you like to see. Roof. I am roof, the winter's truth. Tooth, sorry. I'm rhyming it more than he did. Tooth. Throttle. They call me throttle. Relax, everybody. Back seat. I'm the back seat. Climb up and down. Petroleum. I'm petroleum, love's dream. Doctor. Where the hell is that nurse? Nurse. I'm in the glove compartment. Glove compartment. I'm the glove compartment. Your love department. I don't know why it hasn't been collected, hasn't been reprinted. You people out there. Okay, the next poem was in the magazine anthology Broadway 2, the second of 2 publications featuring the work of both poets and painters, which I co-edited with one of my other poetic heroes, Jimmy Schuyler, whose picture at the age of what looked like 16 flashed by, for those of you who know. We invited a number of people we admired to, quote, send us your best poem or painting, which invitation we got a kick out of. And Kenneth sent homage to Frank O'Hara, 9 short poems honoring, and I would say partly collaborating with, since, although the voice is Kenneth's, there's a good deal of O'Hara in it, his close poet friend. Another thing I remember, which I got a kick out of, was Kenneth, the compulsive reviser, phoning me at the last minute. The anthology was already at the printers, to make a few minor changes. Talk about the 11th hour. So here's the poem. Homage to Frank O'Hara, 9 little ones. The first one is the title of the set, Homage to Frank O'Hara. Sometimes it seems to me I'm possessed by the spirit of Frank O'Hara and should write his poems as he would have written them now. But the only ones I know are ones he's already written. And those are what these turn out to be. Oh well. I can hear Kenneth saying, "Oh well," by the way. I'm sure a lot of you can. There should be more of Frank O'Hara, written at any time, even if his are better. Why not have some of these? And I can at least add subjects. The decease of the Williamsburg Bridge might have inspired him. Williams, whatever got into your steel supports? How am I going to get to Brooklyn to see the 19th century American drawings at the Brooklyn Museum if you won't lift me? Remember, you're named for William Carlos Williams. And he didn't just write a few poems and collapse, did he? No, get up. The second is titled To Frank 2. Junk, junk, junk. And I read in the paper that they've gotten more than $4 million for Pollock. Oh well, he deserves it. Somebody deserves it. He is dead. And Lee deserves it. And Ruth deserves it. She'll probably never get it. Does she deserve it? I don't know. I'm in favor of giving part of it to her, and the rest, say $3.5 million. Ruth, don't be angry like a rocky futon. For buying new crash-proof cars for painters, so they can live forever. I'm eating breakfast and it's already late. To Frank O'Hara, with my inspiration dimming. Nothing's easy if love is love, but love uncalled for is never really love, being too easy, as the walk to 10th Street in the dark is easy if you don't get mugged, and if it's not for love or any other reason that we say of love it wasn't easy. But I am easy, and you are easy. That doesn't mean at all that we're erased or creased, or that some other, is he a crease at all, or only a crash, was ever being easy when the world crashed on him, because of loving that was easy as I love you, and is when that is all. Homage to Frank's uncollected poems. Marston is in Hartford, and Kim is in Cincinnati. I don't know exactly how the syllables are getting fitted, but I have 400 people to call up, and not one's home. Give me a private telepathic service, Manhattan, or I may crease your brow. Last to Frank for a while. Nothing on the radio, and nothing in my head. So I sit down and drink coffee and think. It's hot. It's muggy. I have a faded Jackson Pollock on my wall. Homage to FOH. Well, if you can't get off the telephone, can you get the telephone off you? I'm tired and I want to lie down on you and read Platonov. Untitled. Never again will tone come like to Frank O'Hara's. Never again will poem come, brisk as Apollinarius, weak as Mayakovsky, thumpy as Bertolt Brecht, ivy white as Cavafy, silent with seeds as Regardi, buoyant as Pasternak. Two more. To my Pollock. Picture. If only Jackson had used ink, or paints, or chalk, or even pencil when he made you. But no, he wanted charcoal to get an effect of windiness. Or else I'm at Keller's and it's 4 o'clock, a muggy afternoon, looking at your face, its expression of tenderness that vanishes, or is vanishing, like this Pollock. It's still Wednesday, the wind's delayed. Homage. Mrs. Bubo is out on the sidewalk sitting on the garbage can, a fan jutting from her left hand. She knows it's Pasternak's name day, because she left a pile of Russian roulette wheels skidding across East 10th Street. And now it's Friday afternoon in Memphis, too, where a whole lot of Sphinx is jutting. Thank you. This is, I was going to say it's cheating. It's not cheating. Tony Toll, who was up next, is under the weather and can't make it, and asked me if I would read what he was going to read, which is pretty short but lovely. So this is in the voice of Tony Toll. The first poetry reading I ever attended was here in the New School courtyard on July 15, 1962, the 5th in a series of 6. And it was Kenneth Koch, whose work I knew slightly from the few poems I had read in the famous and notorious Don Allen anthology. However, the unexpected aspect of hearing his work live was that it was funny. The audience, except for me, laughed often and knowledgeably, so I tried to laugh along with them, starting a second or two behind, of course, and to look like the dunce I felt like. I noticed in the program that Koch was teaching a poetry workshop there, meaning here, starting at the end of January, and I was determined to take it. During a quixotic trip to LA that fall, I bought Thank You and Other Poems, just out from Grove Press, in a bookstore on Hollywood Boulevard, and read the poems until I felt I understood the sense made by Koch's extravagant imagery and language and fantastic scenarios. I did come back to New York in time to take his winter-spring 1963 workshop, and it was the smartest and most momentous decision of my literary life. He took each weekly class on a ride, composed of scholarly erudition and unerring wit, including comments and observations on the all-time greats, as he called them, who were not to be worshipped but utilized. He put them on a level where they could inspire you in a direct and informal, as opposed to a remote and untouchable way. The earliest publishable poem in both of my new unselecteds is the dream assignment from Kenneth's workshop. The principles and inspiration that I got from Kenneth's class here 62 years ago have stayed with me to this very day. Whether or not there is such a thing as a New York School of Poetry has been a matter of discussion and dispute for some decades now. John Ashbery seems to have basically thought not. I think it's clear that Kenneth did, and so do I, by the way. It was based on the principles of freedom from academic convention that he taught in his classes. Besides myself, other New School Koch workshop graduates between 1958 and 1966 include Bill Bergson, Jim Brody, Alan Kaplan, Peter Sheldahl, Joe Charavolo, Mary Ferrari, and me. Frank Lima was recommended from a prison workshop. David Shapiro came from a high school program Kenneth taught in New Jersey. Kenneth looked to proselytize outside of his secure position as a professor at Columbia University, where notably Ron Padgett was a student early on. And then there were many more, some of whom are here tonight. I'll end with a no doubt somewhat apocryphal but certainly relevant anecdote I heard in the mid-70s, in which Kenneth and Allen Ginsberg, who was just back from a long stay in India, are at the St. Mark's Poetry Project, where most of the young poets they run across recognize Kenneth and not Allen. Gee, Kenneth, everybody talks to you. Nobody knows who I am anymore. And Kenneth says, that's because you teach your students how to live, Allen. We teach them how to write.
And now if we could cue up the video of Alex Katz.
Sorry, I'll have that listed much later. We're going to the video.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
It should be immediately.
It's at the end of my list. One moment.
Sorry about that. There's two videos, by the way. There's one of Alex Katz and there's one of Kenneth Koch. We want the Alex Katz video now.
Not to break the mood, but they're both at the end of my list, so maybe there's that. You know, writers got to edit, so.
Fair enough. Improvising is in the spirit. Maybe we should fill the time by calling out names of cities in Eastern Europe. I don't know.
Kenneth Koch, it wasn't linear really. And the one of Call of Season on Earth has as much in it as John Jerome by Byron. It's very hard to make a long poem have that kind of continuous big energy. And Kenneth's poems were very outgoing and had a lot of energy. Interlocking Lives, it made this thing of cartoons and left the rooms empty. And Kenneth thought they were terrific. And so he ended up making 3 stories from each set and each picture. And he absolutely destroyed the iconography. I thought it was fabulous. He approached me when I had a cutout show, said how I'd like to do a play with him, and he gave me the script of George Washington. The sets were great for me. I had a lot of fun making them. Yeah, he was high avant-garde, yeah. It's unchecked modernism.
Our next speaker is Maxine Groffsky.
I grew up in the 1940s and 50s in a town where nothing happened, and I wasn't a bohemian or radical in any way. I was a happy square, but I did feel that there had to be more to life than Maplewood, New Jersey. And in the spring of 1958, I came across that big time. I was about to graduate from Barnard College, still pining for my first love who had left me with a colossal broken heart. My girlfriend was going out with a shrink, and I had a blind date with his friend, and they took us downtown to a party in a loft. Who knew from lofts? Turns out to be Elaine de Kooning's place, and a big celebration for the publication of James Schuyler's novel, Alfred and Guinevere. A short play written for the occasion by Kenneth Koch, John Ashbery, and Frank O'Hara was performed twice because everyone liked it so much. The energy and excitement and fun in that studio astonished me. There I was, Alice at the greatest wonderland of all, the world of the poets and painters of the New York School. Howard Kanowitz, a painter, was the only person I met at that party. No one else bothered with me or my girlfriend. Why bother when they were having such a marvelous time with each other? A few weeks later, Howard invited me to another, much smaller downtown party on West 11th Street at the home of the painter Jane Frolicker. Another party, another step into the interlocking circles of poets and painters, dancers and choreographers, composers and playwrights of the bountiful downtown art world. In late May, it seemed everyone left the city and the parties continued in the brilliant light of the Hamptons. Some painters convinced the owners of the Five Spot, the great jazz club featuring Thelonious Monk, to open a place in Watermill for the summer. It was a seedy joint on the Bowery, but in the country they set up in a white clapboard house across from the Green Thumb farm stand, and a hop and a skip from where Jane Frolicker, Jane Wilson, and Kenneth Koch had rentals, and not far from Larry Rivers and Fairfield Porter in Southampton. I didn't know about the Hamptons, jazz, or what I wanted to be when I grew up, but I knew that I didn't want to work in the city that summer. After graduation, I took a job as a waitress at the Five Spot. There was no live music at the unofficial opening of the club in Watermill. It was simply a big cocktail party. Afterwards, Kenneth invited his circle of friends over to his place for food, and I was invited too. I met Larry Rivers at Kenneth's party, and we soon became an item, and so began my life in the Wonderland. That summer, Kenneth and I played a lot of tennis on courts next to the high school in East Hampton, and he could always win by making me laugh during crucial points in the match. Kenneth was fun to be with. He was my great pal, and Jane Frolicker was my closest friend in the group. We played another game that summer, dog baseball. Kenneth, Larry, and I made up the rules, and the game featured Andrew, Kenneth's dog, who was a mix of Dachshund and Scottish Terrier, a breed described as feisty, independent, and somewhat excitable, just like Kenneth and some of his friends. Here was a group of very talented people drawn together by their enthusiasm for each other's work, who had known each other since the late 40s, and no matter the rivalries, conflicts, disappointments, most of the friendships were lifelong. I loved the work they were doing and being part of what John Ashbery later called the effervescent art world of that time. Back in the city, there was a dazzling array of openings, readings, concerts, dance performances, and plays, but nothing like the overwhelming numbers and locations of today. It seemed there was only one art world then, and it was downtown among friends. For me, everyday life had much of the same excitement as that first party at Elaine de Kooning's. Kenneth and I went to the New York premiere of Edward Albee's Zoo Story in December 1959. It was on a double bill with Krapp's Last Tape at the Provincetown Playhouse on McDougal Street. Although Zoo Story had been a great success, we found Albee covering in the stairwell of the theater after the performance. Kenneth wrote many plays, short, elegant, and often hilarious. Bertha was my favorite production, with Sudi Bond as Bertha, Queen of Norway, who often conquered and reconquered her own country. In 1962, I was in the premiere of Kenneth's play, The Construction of Boston, a madcap collaboration presented in a very small theater, literally packed to the rafters. With an audience, I saw Robert Rauschenberg making the rainy weather in Boston, unfortunately soaking those seated in the first rows. Two Merce Cunningham dancers pantomime daily life, Jean Tingley and Henry Gelzeller in bouffant evening gowns, constructed Boston with a wall of concrete blocks that eventually blocked the audience's view. But not before I pushed onto the stage a huge plaster cast of the Venus de Milo, made by Nikita Sanfal for the event and embedded with colored sacks of paint. Nikki, gorgeous in a skin-tight jumpsuit, armed with a rifle, strode down the center aisle of the theater and fired away at the statue. It was mayhem and lasted all of 18 minutes. There was only one performance of this version of the play. At the time, I had a job in the editorial department of Random House, a wonderful place to start a career in publishing. When I became Paris editor of the Paris Review in 1965, Koch, Ashbery, and Schuyler had never appeared in the magazine. They knew how much I admired their work and began sending poems our way. The Interpretation of Dreams was the first poem Kenneth sent. I'm very proud of the great legacy of New York School poetry in the Paris Review. Kenneth loved Paris. He often came to visit or stay for a sabbatical, and we had many, many meals together. In Kenneth's word, lovely, gigantic meals. In the summer of 1969, at one of these feasts, Kenneth told me about the work he was doing with children and poetry. I was moonlighting as a scout for Chelsea House, a small offbeat New York publisher. When I told him about Kenneth's groundbreaking work, They were wild about the book. Fast forward, a little over a year later, Kenneth wrote, "Did you get a copy of Wishes, Lies, and Dreams, your brainchild? It is having a succès d'estime and may have financial success too. I am certainly getting a lot of publicity, having been on the Today Show, the David Frost Show, and when I particularly thought of you, on the Jewish Home Hour, where discussion of my book was interspersed with little comments in Yiddish about some special kind of noodles." Wishes, Lies, and Dreams has now been in print for 55 years. I didn't become a real literary agent until I returned to New York, and Kenneth didn't become a real client, 15% that is, until 1984. The first book I represented was his selected poems, and then he moved forward with all kinds of work. Kenneth wrote everything. He was wildly inventive. He was brilliantly talented, and also, as some of you may know, he could be demanding and impossible. Thinking about Kenneth, all of these words flashed through my mind, but while reading over our conversation for this talk, I realized that the most trying aspect of working with Kenneth for almost 20 years was simply trying to decipher his handwriting. He was thoughtful and smart about publishing and appreciative of the work I was doing. Lucky me to have been his publisher and his literary agent and his friend.
Thanks, Maxine. It was wonderful. Our next reader is Jim Dine.
I've got a few reminiscences. That's it, but a few. He was so generous. To begin with, he was so generous with me as a poet, and the only person who really knew I was writing poems at the time, and very instructive, and just plain nice about everything. But we met in 1966 at a party given by the dual pianists Tisdale and Gold in Bridgehampton. And he was having a drink, and I went up to him. I said, "Jim Dine." He said, "I'm Kenneth Koch." He said, "I'll bet you're called Jimmy." And I said, "How did you know?" He said, "Because in Cincinnati, that's what we do." He was 10 years older than me, and we had the exact same life. We had the same rabbi. We went to the same temple. He went to the same summer camp, and he went to the same high school I did, but 10 years older. He was a great star in my high school, and 10 years later, they were talking about him all the time because he was a good student, and he had a friend who on the faculty called Captain Lappa, who championed him and got him to be a poet, really. I mean, encouraged him. While I was, 10 years later, a dyslexic 18-year-old, 17-year-old bad boy who wanted to be a painter and was Jewish. It wasn't the same thing as he had. Anyway, at this cocktail party, the guest of honor was Leonard Bernstein. And Kenneth didn't know him, and neither did I. But we were drinking a lot, and we kept saying, "Hi, Lenny." And Kenneth then got into a talk with him about
And Kenneth, it was the stuff like Kenneth would say, alas, dear Bernstein, come on over, this sort of thing was going back and forth. Later on, Kenneth said to me, he said, do you think I'm too much like a whore? And I said, Kenneth, it never occurred to me. He said, both of us were. I said, if anybody was, it was you that night. It was really something. Well, we then collaborated in the 60s on a lithograph at Tanya Grossman's at UALE. And then I took Kenneth to meet a woman who sold my prints and published them called Rosa Esmond, and he went nuts. He had this idea that we were going to collaborate and make a book using rare minerals and rare metal. And I kept saying, Kenneth, I don't think it's possible financially to do this. We never got into the idea of what it was going to be about. He was obsessed with copper. We went to all kind of stores on Canal Street to look at the various metals. It came to nothing, obviously. And my last story about Kenneth is when I met him, I really was taken with him, and we were friends. We became friends. And I said, why don't you come over to dinner? And my then wife, Nancy, said, it would be a great idea to invite him, come on. So we invited him, and there was a lot of fun and drinking, and there were other people there. And as he was leaving, and I walked him to the door, and Nancy was there, he bit her on the neck and gave her what was then called a hickey. It made a great impression. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jim Jarmusch.
Thank you. Kenneth Koch, he was my teacher at Columbia. He remains a kind of godfather to me aesthetically, as do two other poets from the New York so-called school that I have had personal interactions with, David Shapiro and Ron Padgett. But the New York school in general remains they remain my godparents in almost anything I create. When I think of Kenneth, I often think of this quote of Oscar Wilde, who said, life is far too important to be taken seriously. Kenneth was very playful. He taught us a lot about structures and being playful with structures. He taught us about the importance of games in a way and creating things. And although he was very playful, he was also very serious and kind of difficult sometimes. He didn't suffer bad poetry. Poetry was very important to him, its strength and its beauty. I'll just tell two little anecdotes. I was going to read two poems, but I think I'll keep it to one to keep it going here. But one anecdote was once I had a conference with Kenneth in his office in Hamilton Hall at Columbia, a relatively small office containing a desk, 2 chairs, and 2 doors of the same dimensions, one of which was the entrance and exit door to the office, and the other a closet. I was talking with Kenneth seriously about what we were studying, etc., for maybe 15 minutes, at which point he paused and said, "Excuse me one moment." He got up and opened the closet door. Exiting from the closet was a very tall, striking, beautiful young woman, maybe a Barnard co-ed or a graduate student. I still remember she had a very soft cashmere cardigan and a pleated skirt, knee socks and loafers, and it was very beautiful. He just opened that door, she exited, he opened the other door and she exited. He closed both doors and sat back down. Nothing was mentioned whatsoever. It seemed very interesting. Another anecdote is Kenneth once gave me a poem by Rilke, and he said, "Now I would like in the next 2 days, bring me back a very beautiful translation of this poem, but however, you can consult no dictionary whatsoever. And I said, great, but Kenneth, I speak or understand absolutely no German. And he said, precisely. So, at first I was going to read a poem that I won't read. One of my favorites is sort of bookending. It's a poem from his last book, New Addresses, called To the Unknown. And it's a very beautiful poem. It's sort of disguised as a love poem to another person, and yet it's a poem to all that we don't know. So I would advise you to do homework and go home and read To the Unknown. Instead, I'm just going to read an earlier poem, a very early poem you might know. It's from the great, the Bible, the anthology of New York poets that David Shapiro and Ron Padgett put together in 1975. And it's a poem called You Were Wearing. You were wearing your Edgar Allan Poe printed cotton blouse. In each divided up square of the blouse was a picture of Edgar Allan Poe. Your hair was blonde and you were cute. You asked me, do most boys think that most girls are bad? I smelled the mold of your seaside resort hotel bedroom on your hair, held in place by a John Greenleaf Whittier clip. No, I said, it's girls who think that boys are bad. Then we read Snowbound together and ran around in an attic so that a little of the blue enamel was scraped off my George Washington Father of his country's shoes. Mother was walking in the living room, her Strauss waltz's comb in her hair. We waited for a time and then joined her, only to be served tea in cups painted with pictures of Herman Melville, as well as with illustrations from his book Moby Dick and from his novella Benito Sereno. Father came in wearing his Dick Tracy necktie. How about a drink, everyone? I said, let's go outside a while. Then we went out onto the porch and sat on the Abraham Lincoln swing. You sat on his eyes, mouth, and beard part, and I sat on the knees. In the yard across the street, we saw a snowman holding a garbage can lid smashed into a likeness of the mad English king, George III.
Next up is John Keene.
So probably unlike all the other speakers, I never met Kenneth Koch, but I had the good fortune to begin reading him when I was in junior high school, and was a huge fan of his work, and thought of him as a comic poet primarily. And then I came across this poem, which I'm going to read, and thanks so much to Jordan for allowing me to read this poem. And it is so suffused with feeling that it transformed, one of many of his poems, it transformed my kind of sense of him as a poet. I think he's an extraordinary poet, and I'm going to share this poem with you. It's called The Circus, and this is actually the second poem he wrote called The Circus, and he refers to that in this poem. I remember when I wrote The Circus, I was living in Paris, or rather we were living in Paris, Janice. Frank was alive. The Whitney Museum was still on 8th Street, or was it still something else? Fernand Léger lived in our building. Well, it wasn't really our building, it was the building we lived in, next to a Grand Guignol troupe who made a lot of noise, so that one day I yelled through a hole in the wall of our apartment. I don't know why there was a hole there. Shut up! And the voice came back to me saying something, I don't know what. Once I saw Léger walk out of the building, I think. Stanley Kunitz came to dinner. I wrote The Circus in 2 tries, the first getting most of the first stanza. That fall, I also wrote an opera libretto called Louisa or Matilda. Jean-Claude came to dinner. He said about cocktail sauce, it should be good on something, but not on these oysters. See, there's the humor, and then the feeling is coming. Listen. By that time, I think I'd already written the circus when I came back, having been annoyed to have to go. I forget what I went there about. You were back in the apartment, what a dump. Actually, we liked it, I think, with your hair and your writing and the pans moving strongly about the kitchen. I wrote the circus. It was a summer night. No, it was an autumn one summer when I remember it, but actually no autumn, that black dusk toward the post office. And I wrote many other poems then, but the circus was the best. Maybe not by far the best. Geography was also wonderful. And the airplane Betty poems inspired by you, but the circus was the best. Sometimes I feel I actually am the person who did this, who wrote that, including that poem, The Circus, but sometimes on the other hand, I don't. There are so many factors engaging our attention. At every moment, the happiness of others, the health of those we know and our own, and the millions upon millions of people we don't know and their well-being to think about. So it seems strange I found time to write The Circus and even spent 2 evenings on it, and that I have also the time to remember that I did it and remember you and me then and write this poem about it at the beginning of the circus. The circus girls are rushing through the night in the circus wagons, and tulips and other flowers will be picked. A long time from now, this poem wants to get off on its own, someplace like a painting, not held to a depiction of composing. The circus. Noel Lee was in Paris then, but usually out of it, in Germany or Denmark, giving a concert as part of an endless activity, which was either his career or his happiness or a combination of both. Or neither. I remember his dark eyes looking. He was nervous with me, perhaps because of our days at Harvard. It is understandable enough to be nervous with anybody. Love it. How softly and easily one feels when alone. Love of one's friends when one is commanding the time and space syndrome, if that's the right word, which I doubt, but together, how come one is so nervous? One is not always, but what I was then and what I am now, attempting to create, if create is the right word, out of this combination of experience and aloneness. And who are you telling me it is or is not a poem? Not you. Go back with me, though, to those nights I was writing The Circus. Do you like that poem? Have you read it? It is in my book, Thank You, which Grove just reprinted. I wonder how long I'm going to live and what the rest will be like. I mean, the rest of my life. John Cage said to me the other night, "How old are you?" And I told him 46. Since then, I've become 47. He said, "Oh, that's a great age. I remember." John Cage once told me he didn't change much for his mushroom identification course at the New School because he didn't want to make a profit from nature. He was ahead of his time. I was behind my time. We were both in time. Brilliant, go to the head of the class and, quote, "Time is a river," unquote. It doesn't seem like a river to me. It seems like an unformed plan. Days go by and still nothing is decided about what to do until you know it never will be. And then you say time, but you really don't care much about it anymore. Time means something when you have a major part of yours ahead of you, as I did in Aix-en-Provence. That was 3 years before I wrote The Circus. That year I wrote Bricks and The Great Atlantic Rainway. I felt time surround me like a blanket, endless and soft. I could go to sleep endlessly and wake up and still be in it, but I treasured secretly the part of me that was individually changing like Noel Lee. I was interested in my career and still am, but now it is like a town I don't want to leave, not a tower I am climbing opposed by ferocious enemies. I never mentioned my friends in my poems at the time I wrote The Circus, although they meant almost more than anything to me. Of this now, for some time, I felt an attenuation. So I'm mentioning them, maybe this will bring them back to me, not them perhaps, but what I felt for them. John Ashbery, Jane Frolicker, Larry Rivers, Frank O'Hara, their names alone bring tears to my eyes, as seeing Polly did last night. It is beautiful at any time, but the paradox is leaving it. In order to feel it when you come back, the sun has declined and the people are merrier, or else they've gone home altogether. And you're left alone, well, you put up with that. Your sureness is like the sun while you have it, but when you don't, it's lax, a black and icy night. I came home and wrote The Circus that night, Janice. I didn't come and speak to you and put my arm around you and ask you if you'd like to take a walk or go to the Cirque Medrano. Well, that's what I wrote poems about, and I'm writing about that now, and now I'm alone, and this is not as good a poem as the circus, and I wonder if any good will come of either of them all the same. Thank you.
The next speaker is Phillip Lopate.
I was asked to speak specifically about Kenneth Koch's fiction, so that's what I'm going to do. Kenneth Koch wrote a fair amount of fiction, all of which has been assembled by Jordan Davis in a Coffee House Press paperback, The Collected Fiction of Kenneth Koch. In one story, an autobiographical narrator comically laments. He says, I wanted to be a ball player. I wanted to be a cartoonist, like the person who drew Maggie and Jigs. I wanted to be a poet. Then why, are you writing the prose? I can't help it. I am a poet. And something in me cried out, prose, write fiction. I would like to speculate about what possibilities fiction gave him that poetry didn't. But first I want to review how I first came to know Kenneth as an English professor at Columbia when I was an undergraduate. He taught a popular course on the comic and literature, which all my friends took and which featured mostly fiction writers. I did not take the course, or indeed any that Koch taught, for the silly reason that I was leery about being dominated by a charismatic teacher who sent my friends soaring one week and crestfallen the next. But as it happened, I was attracted to some of the very books he was teaching, especially Italos Favos' Confessions of Zeno and Machado de Assis' Don Cosmoro. These masters of ironic first-person prose demonstrated, among other things, the connection between the analytical and the comic. The analytical mode often bleeds into rationalization and self-defense, and also seems like it could go on forever. This is something to keep in mind in examining his first ambitious attempt at fiction, the long story entitled The Postcard Collection. It begins with the narrator puzzling over a set of postcards and hypothesizing the relationship between the sender and the receiver of the correspondence. The postcards are described in fastidious detail along the lines of a Georges Perec exercise or a nouveau roman. Then suddenly the narrator breaks in and declares, I love you. It's ridiculous to try to hide this from you by going over the collection. When I see the blue on the card, I see your eyes. They float into my vision, and there is no more work possible that day. Or if yes, if there is still work possible, it is no longer work of the same kind, for all my clear observation is disturbed by an overwhelming desire to tell a truth, which is not, so to speak, in the cards. This declamation is followed by a rather surprising admission for the Kenneth Koch of the ebullient thank you poems. He writes, a fear then of being naive, or perhaps even a far deeper problem, a mistrust of all of one's emotions. Perhaps more accurately, this one great emotional scar one terrible wound inflicted by and on one's feelings at some time in one's life, then forever after, every emotion strongly or spontaneously felt, every feeling which seems to shadow these painful and primal ones, these huge feelings which should not work out to shadow them, every such emotion then recalling the large painful ones, thus every access of joy immediately corrected by painful remembrance, by pain, end quote. The narrator continues in the story to grapple with a sense of his inauthenticity or unreality, even coming to the conclusion that, quote, the least we can say is that there are a great many human relationships and a great many situations inside other relationships in which there is no communication without disguise and self-mockery. As for the doubling of my reality to the point of doubting one's own existence, which I said I wanted to connect with the self-hatred and self-mockery implicit in communication, I now think the connection is perfectly obvious, because these feelings are precisely what one needs to convince that one is really alive and out there. It is true, however, that the final product is almost always a disappointment. All these communications represented by the poems and cards are disappointments. End quote. It has been too rarely commented upon in writings about Koch that while he is often seen as the Pied Piper of joy and pleasure, sensuality, and fresh air, the obverse is how often he felt disappointed. In any case, even if we were to regard these dark, negative pronouncements as a pose, he still sounds very much like an analysand questioning himself. We know from his poem To Psychoanalysis in the beautiful late collection New Addresses that Kenneth was in Freudian analysis for 2 years in the 1950s, going 5 days a week, and only stopping when his psychiatrist thought he didn't need any more treatment. But he admits that afterwards, he could never think of anything seriously for 15 years without also thinking of his psychoanalysis. Here I would like to take a step back and consider the ambivalent attitude of Koch and his fellow New York School poets towards psychology and the personal. At the time, there was a fissure between his faction and the so-called confessional poets, such as Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, and John Berman, who were getting a lot of attention. Kenneth considered them academic, which was to him the kiss of death. In any case, boring. Parenthetically, academia took its revenge by never according him the same respect they would his contemporaries, since a comic poet is never taken as seriously as a serious one. John Ashbery declared in something he wrote, A Conversation with Kenneth Koch, which appeared around the same period as the postcard collection, 1965, that he would never put, quote, a statement in a poem. Poetry does not have subject matter because it is a subject. This was like Balanchine saying in those years that dance was about dance, and de Kooning that painting was about paint. The New York School poets were much more attracted to French poetry with its surrealism and play with language than to the more personal, statement-oriented British and American poets. Even Frank O'Hara, who had found a way to write engagingly about his personal life and had even penned a manifesto called Personism, nevertheless ended the poem a step away from them with the line, My heart is in my pocket. It is Poems by Pierre Reverdy. Koch stated clearly to the question, does a poem reveal something about me I never want anyone to know? The answer should be no. So stay away from confession. Stick with the pleasure of language. But Koch was clearly pulled in two directions. And I would maintain that fiction gave him an initial opportunity to be more openly psychological. It also drew him into abstraction, which made him very nervous. He said in the postcard collection, quote, I sense I feel a certain need to be saved from the billowing abstractions and uncertainties which my previous hypothesis got me into. Abstract ideas are really horrible seducers, leading me away from the part of the neighborhood I know, like parents with their arms outstretched who keep moving backwards and then down the stairs. What I always end up in is a real heap of, when I am so separated from the real, is self-hatred and disgust, and precisely that feeling that I am out of contact with reality. End quote. In that same vein, in the conversation with Ashbery, he said, I myself am bored by my attempts to make abstract statements, and I wish I could do it as facilely as you. Ashbery, for his part, mostly complimented Koch on his ability to make absurd linguistic combinations, as in his long poem, When the Sun Tries to Go On. Koch's next excursion into fiction was the full-length novel, The Red Robins, published 10 years later in 1975. Playful, whimsical, and essentially a lark, it follows the adventures of a group of travelers roaming the earth. In it, Koch experimented with Raymond Roussel-like dream impressions, poetic insertions, and every literary genre imaginable. Dogs talk, tigers soliloquize, and Santa Claus turns out to be a monstrous villain. The Easter rabbit is no better. Much attention is given over to women semi-nude, their breasts described with elaborate metaphors. Paragraphs proceed via sentences that have no ostensible logical link, such as, quote, toilets of silence and the marzipan ring, all the old places it used to go, now they jet quietly at the still quivering body of the gigantic airman. Lake Hugh and Kugan looked up hotly at the hovering silver eagle, and so on. There are passages of gorgeously musical prose, fabulously described landscapes, colorful sunsets, and raunchy octopi, but finally all that inventiveness becomes tiresome. Gone are the analytical attempts to get to the bottom of human suffering. Instead, the pursuit of happiness and breezy fun seems to be the ruling idea. No characters have been fleshed out enough for a reader like me to grow concerned about their fate, though that would have made it sound like realist fiction, clearly a no-no. The Red Robins does not in the end speak to me. I was much more enthusiastic about his next work of fiction, Hotel La Mosa, which appeared in 1993, almost 20 years after The Red Robins. In that interim, he and I had become friends. He had known me from the old days as one of the literary boys of Columbia Review, a student, but not his student, as I had no desire to be one of his gopher acolytes, and could only stand a chance of befriending him when I myself had acquired some distinction and we could meet on a more equal footing. We went to movies together, played tennis in the Hamptons, he much better and more competitive. He came to my wedding. We talked about books, life, and the people we knew. His poetry had changed meanwhile. He had written those magnificently frank, vulnerable, wrenchingly personal poems, such as To Marina and With Janice and the Circus, about lost friendships, marital breakups, and love affairs that came to know it. When Hotel Lambosa was finished, I was asked by one of his ex-students to help find a publisher for it, which I was happy to, though I doubt it needed me. I was immediately taken with the manuscript. The book consists of 85 pieces, all short, a page or two. Koch was following the model of Kawabate's Palm of the Hand stories. Many of the stories are autobiographical. There are tender, rueful memoir pieces about traveling in Europe with his young wife and baby daughter and his parents. In the very first story I read, quote, "What do you think about the situation, Stuart?" my mother said. "What situation?" said my father. "The fact that Kenny and Janice pay so little attention to us." This was the first time Koch had ever written about his mother, a narcissist of the first order and a real piece of work. All that psychoanalysis was finally paying off. The prose is clear, straightforward, and unpretentious, even as dreams and fantasies recur in it. Another piece begins, "At 26, one night in Paris, I dreamed that my parents came to visit me. The dream had the vividness of an hallucination. It was shuddering and shaking, it seemed, throughout the hotel. My mother said, 'Kenneth!' Her voice was loud and intimate at the same time. Then my father shouted my name too. They both appeared at my door," unquote. The dream devolves into a memory of writing poetry and chasing girls, as so often occurred in these pieces. He wrote, "I wrote a poem in this hotel room. I wrote several poems, but none worked out. The one that I liked was really only part of a poem. The 4 lines I wrote were written 3 years before I had ever seen Ekaterina. I was not even a graduate student at this time. At this time, I courted Sonia and Gilbert and Anna of the dark smiles and eyes. Anna of, I don't know how to kiss. All this and all these were far from, I do know how to kiss, of Ekaterina, and I know what follows after. And be careful, you are playing with fire. To which I replied, stupidly, what else is there to play with? Ekaterina was a moderately tall blonde woman in a candy-striped green and white dress in an undergraduate class at Rutgers, the same age I was, 29, and soon after meeting her, I finished the poem. End quote. Erotic desire and literary ambition jammed together in these pieces. Regarding the aforementioned Gilbert, who was the same name as the character in Proust, Kenneth wrote, I was immediately interested in this particular girl because her name was Gilbert. This was because of Proust. Gilbert and I joked around. I was happy to know enough French to be able to talk to her. She seemed glad of my acquaintance, as odd as I must have seemed to her, a tall, skinny, rather clumsy American. This is 1950, and always joking in a language I didn't entirely understand. She wasn't exactly pretty. She had the trace of a mustache and rather dark skin. She wasn't exactly happy either, nor joyous, nor what is called full of life. Sometimes she seemed very sad. If I asked about it, Gilbert would tell me that she had les idées noires, the black ideas, dark, unhappy thoughts. But what did I know? Gilbert's reality ended for me with the wall of a large building that held her tiny room. I never saw it. She never invited me or permitted me in. There to be succeeded by an irresistibly seductive reality in the pages of Proust. Though I was reading Remembrance of Things Past, I did not at that time understand how horrible the life in it was. I felt its great variety, its nobility, its sensuousness, and its heroism, and I wanted it to be mine. End quote. As far-fetched as this may sound, I cannot help thinking of these memoir pieces as Kenneth's own remembrance of things past, and of a certain resemblance between him and the ultra-sensitive Marcel. Kenneth had very particular literary tastes when it came to fiction. He loved Stendhal, as did I. He said he didn't like English and American novels, which I considered unfortunate on his part. He was very fond of the Sicilian mystery writer Leonardo Sciascia. Because he thought of me as a prose and fiction writer, he would ask me to recommend novels for him to read. After lengthy consideration, I recommended Fortunata and Jacinta by the great 19th century Spanish novelist Pérez Galdós. He reported back to me that he found it disappointing. Oh well. One final note on Koch's relation to fiction writing. Teaching was an important part of Kenneth's life. Some of the most affecting pieces in Hotel Mombasa have to do with his teaching in Africa. As any self-aware instructor knows, there can be an element of theatrical performance in commanding a classroom, and Kenneth certainly knew how to project himself in person, which is not the same thing as being able to write about teaching convincingly. So when he came to do his first teaching book, Wishes, Lies, and Dreams, he struggled with finding the right tone and persona. It took him a while before he was able to hit upon the voice that would carry these pedagogic treatises. The prose had to be absolutely clear, yet never condescending, to the teachers and parents who would likely be his audience. His narrator came across, in the end, as amiable, enthusiastic, well-versed in the subject of poetry, but not a pedant, endearingly good-humored, and maybe even a little goofy. Those who knew Kenneth intimately knew this was not the whole of his complicated personality. It was a self-invented character, a fiction, you might say, even if the books are widely considered non-fiction. The enormous success of these teaching books showed how well he carried it off. In any case, this pedagogic eye character was a far cry from the morose narrator of the postcard collection with its self-disgust and fears of being unreal. It was one more proof that Kenneth knew how to write fiction. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Our next reader is Lucy Sante.
Kenneth led me into his poetry writing class in my first year at Columbia, and I thought I was hot shit. I thought I was the teenage poet. And then the second year I took his prosody classes. I realized about halfway through that, like Monsieur Jourdan, I was a prose writer. But then I went on to teach writing for 27 years, and I should have been paying Kenneth royalties because I just adapted. And he became the teacher for me, the model. But the one thing I could never quite match up to was his enthusiasm. Kenneth loved poetry and communicated his joy and just love of it as if he just discovered it last week. So with that, I'll take up any more of your time than is necessary. I will read the last third or so of my favorite poem by him, Sleeping with Women. Asleep and sleeping with you, asleep with women. Asleep and sleeping with you, asleep with women. Asleep and sleeping with you, sleeping with women. As if the sun, as of Venice in the Middle Ages, true Renaissance had just barely walked by the yucca forest, asleep and sleeping with you. In China, on parade, sleeping with women. And in the sun, asleep and sleeping with you, sleeping with women. Asleep with women, the docks, the alley, and the prude. Sleeping with women, asleep with them. The dune god, sleeping with women. The dove, asleep and sleeping with them. Dials, sleeping with women. Cybernetic tiles, asleep and sleeping with them. Naples, sleeping with women, the short of breath. Asleep and sleeping with you, sleeping with women, as if I were you, moon idealism, sleeping with women, pieces of stage ward, sleeping with women, the silent bus ride, sleeping with you, the chore, sleeping with women, the force of a disaster, sleeping with you, the organ grinder's daughter, asleep with bitumen, sunshine, sleeping with women, sleeping with women in Greece, in China, in Italy, sleeping with blue, red, green, orange, and white women, sleeping with 2, 3, 4, and 5 women, sleeping on the outside and on the inside of women, a violin like a vista, women, sleeping with women. In the month of May and June and July, sleeping with women. I watched my life go by sleeping with women. A door of pine, a storm-filled Valentine, asleep and sleeping with them. This Sunday heart of mine, profoundly dormoused with them. Then they running and laughing, asleep and sleeping with them. This idle heart of mine, insanely schmoozled, sleep and sleeping with them. They running in laughter. To the nearest time, oh doors of eternity, oh young women's doors of my own time, sleeping with women, asleep and sleeping with them, all Naples sleeping and sleeping with them, Venice sleeping with women, Burgos sleeping with women, Lausanne sleeping with women, hail depth divers sleeping with women, and here is the bonfire of Crete, catching divorcements' fingers, purple, sleeping with women, and the red lights of dawn. Have you seen them? Green ports, sleeping with women, acrobats in pawns. You had not known if ere I told you asleep with women. The Via Appia Antica, sleeping with women, asleep and sleeping with them. All beautiful objects, each ugly, ugly object, the intelligent world. The arena of the spirits, the dietetic whiskey, the storms, sleeping with women, asleep and sleeping with them, sleeping with women, and the churches in Antigua sleeping with women, the stone, a vow, the Nereid, a promise to sleep with women, the coal, a convention, sleeping with women, the carriage, sleeping with women, the time, sometimes, the certainty, now. The soapbox, sleeping with women. The time and again, nubile and time, sleeping with women, and the time now. Asleep and sleeping with them. Asleep and asleep, sleeping with women. Asleep and sleeping with them, sleeping with women. Thank you.
Next reader, put him as a typo. The next reader is Jeffrey Harrison.
I was fortunate enough to take Kenneth Koch's imaginative writing class in 1976-77 with Daniel Melton, Jessica Greenbaum, who are right over there, and Steve Ackerman, another wonderful poet. I'm not going to say much, I'm just going to read 2 poems. I'm going to read Kenneth Koch's poem Fate from The Burning Mystery of Anna in 1951, and then I'm going to read a poem of my own that's about a Kenneth Koch-inspired dream. Fate. In a room on West 10th Street in June of 1951, Frank O'Hara and I and Larry Rivers, I actually do not remember if Larry was there, but he would be there later, some winter night, on the stairway, sitting, waiting, a demented telephone, as Frank said in an article about him. But then, on the stairs, unhappy in a youthful manner, much happened later. Frank, John Ashbury, Jane Freilicher, and I had just come back from Europe for the first time. I had a bottle of Irish whiskey I had bought in Shannon, where the plane stopped, and we drank it, and I told my friends about Europe. They'd never been there, how much I'd loved it. I was so happy to be there with them. and my Europe too, which I had, Greece, Italy, France, Scandinavia, and England. Imagine having all that the first time. The walls were white in that little apartment, so tiny, the rooms are so small, but we all fitted into one and talked. Frank so sure of his talent, but didn't say it that way. I didn't know until after he was dead just how sure he had been. And John, unhappy and brilliant and silly, and of all of them, my first friend. We had met at Harvard. They tended, except Frank, to poo-poo what I said about Europe. And even Frank was more interested, but ever polite. When sober, I couldn't tell it, but barely tended. They tended to be much more interested in gossip, such as who had been sleeping with whom, and what was selling and going on. Whereat I was a little hurt, but used to it. My expectations for my friendships were absurd, but that way I got so much out of them. In fact, it wasn't causal, but the two ways at once. I was never so happy with anyone as I was with those friends at that particular time, on that day with that bottle of Irish whiskey, the time 4 in the afternoon, or 3 in the afternoon, or 2 or 5, I don't know what. And why do I think that my being so happy is so urgent and important? It seems some kind of evidence of the truth, as if I could go back and take it, or do I just want to hold what there is of it now? Thinking says hold something now, which is why despite me and liking me that afternoon, who was sleeping with whom was best, and my happiness, picking up a glass, Frank, what was it like, Kenny? Ah, from my being vulnerable, only sometimes I can see the vulnerableness in others I have ever known, faults with them or on the telephone. The sexual adventures were different, each person at work, autobiography all the time, plowing forward. If there's no question of movement, as there isn't, no doubt of it, may I not, I may, find this minute extraordinary. I can do nothing with it but write about it. 240 West 10th Street, Jane's apartment, 1951 or 52, I can never remember. Yes, it was later or much earlier that Larry sat on the stairs. And John said, hum, and hum, and hum. I don't remember the words. Frank said, unhun. Jane said, unhun. And Larry, if he was there, said boobly-boop. So always said Larry, or almost. And I said, Aix-en-Provence, me, new sense of these, that London, Firenze, Florence, now Greece, and unhun, boop. Soon I was at Larry's, and he's proposing we take a house in Easton. What? For the summer, where's that? And already that afternoon was dissipated, another begun, many more of them. But that was one I remember. I was in a special position, as if it were my birthday. But they were in fact as if my birthday, or that is to say, who cares if he grows older, if he has friends like these? I mean, who does not care? The celebration is the cause of the sorrow, and not the other way around. I also went to Venice and to Vienna. There were some people who drove me there. New sunshine, Frank says, let's go out, Jane, John, Frank, and I. Larry was not there, I now remember, then mysteriously left. This is called Amnesia. Everything in it is true. In my dream, someone mentioned Kenneth Koch's great poem, Amnesia. I don't remember that when I said, but suddenly as though projected on the air, I could see the first few lines. I decided to go home and find the rest of the poem, but couldn't remember where home was. When I woke up, of course, I was home, but I didn't remember those lines from the poem. And when I looked through Kenneth's books, I didn't find a poem called Amnesia, or even To Amnesia, one of his apostrophes, which might have begun, I'm sorry I forgot to write a poem about you until now. Remembering that the internet remembers everything, supposedly, I Googled Kenneth Koch plus Amnesia and found a poem entitled Amnesia in the online magazine Jacket by the Australian poet John Kinsella, but dedicated to Kenneth Koch. Weird. Was I still dreaming? No. I liked the poem, but couldn't help thinking it wasn't quite as much fun as Kenneth Koch's amnesia would be. A poem that exists only in my dream and wherever dreams go when you wake up. A poem whose first few lines I briefly knew but can't retrieve, though I can picture him writing it in his headlong scrawl. And I won't forget that in my dream, someone, though I can't remember who, called it great, unforgettable.
The next reader is Ron Padgett.
I think after I speak, there's going to be a little film of Kenneth. The piece I'm going to read is something I wrote about 20 years ago. Is the volume okay? Yes. Traveling with Kenneth. Remember, this is 20 years ago. During a recent performance of La Bohème at the Stockholm Opera, when Rodolfo and Mimi, at the end of the first act, floated off on a luminous pale blue rectangle into total darkness, I thought of how Kenneth might have been as thrilled as I was when he sat in that same hall 3 years ago, with its over-the-top rococo golden swirling depictions of gods and nymphs amid festoons and putti arching above us, as the singers opened their mouths and released vibrations so large and round they filled the entire theater. The sheer ambitiousness of it all was overwhelming. 3 years ago, in Stockholm with Kenneth, I hadn't even thought of going to the opera there, but Kenneth had. And that I have now gone too tells me that yet another part of him has gone into me, where I like to imagine that it will go on living. At intermission, my companion and I walked out onto the spacious balcony that overlooks the square of Gustav Adolfstorg. In the deliciously cool early evening, the Parliament building to our left was glowing dimly, with the pointy church spires of the old part of town, Gamla Stan, just beyond, and the water flowing past Strandparterren, the little park celebrated by Valery Larbaud in his long poem, Europe, which Kenneth inspired me to translate 30 years ago. Strandparterren, where a few couples were watching the evening arrive. And suddenly, the air sparkled, and I turned to my companion and I said to her, "How lucky we are," as if the happiness were there just for us at that very moment, the happiness that Kenneth pursued so eagerly, as if it were a goddess, one he caught and held more often than one might imagine, as he did one spring night in Paris around 15 years ago, when we were strolling alongside the wrought iron fence of the Luxembourg Gardens, and he gestured to the full moon and the clear sky and said, "Isn't this just ravishing?" and laughed, as if he had just been presented with a wonderful surprise. Earlier in the day of the opera, looking across the water toward the Stockholm skyline from a high point in Skansen, I heard Kenneth's voice in my head saying, "I was on a ski trip," quoting his own prose poem that describes the energy he had felt as a young man on his way to this spot 50 or so years ago, excited by the Swedish girls on the ferry with him. Kenneth, they are still there, those girls, and there are more of them. And when they walk toward you, it is as if their clothes are slipping from their bodies. In the Pittsburgh airport, one snowy afternoon about 6 years ago, there were no such marvels. Our connecting flight had been postponed several hours. To escape the hubbub and ennui, Kenneth and I headed toward what airport management called the meditation room. Shortly after we entered via its automatic sliding glass door, a blue glow arose rose along the white walls that curved up into a dome as a low hum was suffused into the air. Silently, the door slid shut behind us. In an accent of a man of exotic but indeterminate origin, I said in a deep voice, "Welcome to our country, Mr. Bond." And Kenneth burst into an uncontrollable laughter that came in wave after wave as he kept re-experiencing my improvisation. To have made Kenneth laugh like that, a small return to the many times his poems and his conversation had given me joy, was for me one of the happiest moments I had with him. From that time on, he signed his letters and cards to me 007, as if the pleasure of my witticism were still radiating inside him. Several months later, we were in San Francisco to give a poetry reading. After checking into a classy little boutique hotel, we went up to our respective rooms. A few minutes later, Kenneth knocked at my door. "How is your room?" he asked. "It's nice," I said. "It's very comfy." He strode over to the window. "But you don't have a balcony." I said, I don't know, that's okay. "You don't want a balcony? Go down and tell them to give you a balcony." Kenneth wanted all of life to have a balcony.
And now if we could have the video of Kenneth.
The next passage is from a poem called The Pleasures of Peace, which was a sort of a protest poem about the Vietnam War. Though it turned out not to be about the war so much as about the pleasures of the peace movement and the joys of peace. And this is the last part of the poem. And the big boats come sailing into the harbor for peace, and the little apes are running around the jungle for peace, and the day, that is the star of day, the sun, is shining for peace. Somewhere a mustachioed student is puzzling over the works of Raymond Roussel for peace, and the Mediterranean peach trees are fast asleep for peace, with their pink arms akimbo, and the blue plums of Switzerland for peace, and the monkeys are climbing for coconuts and peace, the Hawaiian palm. And serpents are writhing for peace, those are snakes, and the Alps, Mount Vesuvius, all the really big important mountains are rising for peace, and they're filled with rocks. Surely it won't be long. And Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper is moving across the monastery wall a few micrometers for peace, and Paolo Uccello's Red Horses are turning a little redder for peace, and the Anglo-Saxon dining hall begins glowing like crazy, and Beowulf, Robert E. Lee, Sir Barbarossa, and Baron Jeep are sleeping on the railways for peace, and darting around the harbor, and leaping into the sailboats, and the sailboats will go on, and underneath the sailboats the sea will go on, and we will go on, and the birds will go on, and the snappy words will go on, and the tea sky and the sloping marine sky, and the hustle of beans will go on, and the unserious canoe. It will all be going on in connection with you, peace. And my poem, like a Cadillac of wampum, unredeemed and flying madly, will go exploding through new cities, sweet inflated, planispheres, ingenious hair, a camera-smashing badinage, cerebral stands of atmospheres, unequal, dreamed of impeachments, candled piers, fumisteries, emphatic moods, terrestrialism's crackle, love's flat, sun's sweets, oh, peace to you. Oh, I was happy to read that again. I haven't read it for a long time.
Thank you for coming. Before you go, we have one surprise. Karen Koch.
That's my big surprise. Thank you very much. We had planned to have an enormous cake
to be able to, for us all to, at this point, to eat. Unfortunately, the rules here don't allow such things. And so I thought it might be nice, because Kenneth loved his birthday. I mean, 100 years, that's pretty wonderful. So would you join me in singing him happy birthday?
Yeah.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Kenneth. Happy birthday to you. Thank you all.
Yours is great. Yours is great.
Got through it. We got through it. I can figure it out. I said I can figure out how to end this. Well, it's good enough. Anyway, I'm glad to see you. How are the treatments doing? You okay? You don't seem, yeah. All right. Well, you take care. Yeah. I wanted to take everybody out, but there's no, here we are. St. Patrick's Day, the village, the hell with I don't want to do that.
I'm just
Well,
the opera, particularly.
no, I haven't bought anything for years, you know.
Yes,
No, I actually went out and bought a store that right next to